All right, let's get right into it. After the complete and utter devastation of World War II, Europe didn't just rebuild its cities. No, it tried to rebuild the very idea of what a society could be, all based on a really radical new promise.
I mean, just think about that for a second. What if the government guaranteed your well-being from the day you're born all the way to your final days? Now, this wasn't some kind of fantasy. This was the central driving question behind the creation of the modern European welfare state.
So, to really get a grip on this massive project, we've got to go back to the beginning. You have to picture a post-war Europe, a continent just in ruins.
No, leaders at the time were facing two gigantic problems at once. The first one was obvious, right? You got to physically rebuild an entire continent that's been shattered by war. But there was this other, deeper fear that was haunting them, the memory of the Great Depression. That economic collapse had fueled so much chaos and extremism, and they were absolutely determined not to let that happen again.
And all that determination led them to this really bold two-part solution, a massive economic jumpstart and a revolutionary New Deal for society, the cradle-to-grave promise.
So, part one of the plan, a huge injection of cash. Through what was called the Marshall Plan, the United States poured $13 billion into Western Europe. And look, this wasn't just a handout. It was like the jumper cables for a dead car battery. It was the fuel needed to get the engine of industry and infrastructure roaring back to life.
And that engine was going to be guided by a whole new philosophy, Keynesian economics. The basic idea is actually pretty simple, but really powerful. Instead of just letting the economy ride its own wild roller coaster of booms and busts, the government should actually get in the driver's seat, spending money to create jobs and boost growth, especially when times get tough.
So what did this all mean for you, the average person? Well, this is where that cradle-to-grave promise really comes alive. We're talking about subsidized healthcare, getting a university education without a mountain of debt, feeling secure when you're older with a pension, and having a real safety net if you happen to lose your job.
And if you want to see the best real-world example of this whole idea in action, you gotta look at Great Britain. They pretty much wrote the playbook for everyone else.
It was a pretty clear four-step process. Right after the war, the Labour Party swept into power with a huge mandate for change. They immediately started rolling out these massive social programs, like the National Health Service, and opened up access to education. And how'd they pay for it all? Through much higher taxes. But it was a trade-off people were willing to make, as long as the economy was humming along.
And this model had a core strength, but also a potentially fatal flaw. On the one hand, it was a massive success. It really did reduce poverty and create a level of social stability that was unheard of. But, and this is a huge but, the entire system depended on one single critical thing: a constantly growing economy that would keep the tax money flowing in.
So that leads to the big question. What happens when that assumption turns out to be wrong? Because in the 1970s, the economic engine that powered this whole social experiment just began to sputter, and then stall.
Europe got hit with a 1-2 punch. Two major recessions almost back-to-back. And these were not your typical economic downturns. Oh no, they brought with them a very strange and very toxic new problem that nobody really knew how to fix.
They called it stagflation. And just look at the word, it tells you everything. Stagnant, that means the economy stops growing, which means high unemployment. And inflation, that means the prices for literally everything are skyrocketing. For the welfare state, this was an absolute nightmare scenario. You've got fewer people working and paying taxes, but at the same time, the cost of providing all those services is just going through the roof.
This table really captures that shift perfectly. In the golden age of the 50s and 60s, you had all this prosperity paying for everything through high taxes. Easy enough. But then, you hit the 70s and 80s, the economy's in crisis, and governments are trapped. They couldn't raise taxes enough to cover the costs, but they also couldn't just stop spending. So they chose a third option. They started borrowing money.
And that single decision, to start borrowing, leads us directly to the unsettled legacy of the welfare state. It's a debate that is still raging in politics today. And here's the political trap they were in. These programs, healthcare, pensions, unemployment benefits, were and still are incredibly popular. I mean, people had built their entire lives around this promise. No politician wanted to be the one to stand up and say they were going to take it all away, even when the economic math just didn't add up anymore.
So this pivot, this move from a system funded by taxes to one that's propped up by government debt, that's the crucial turning point. It's the beginning of all the modern arguments we hear constantly about national debt, about government spending, and about whether our social safety nets are even sustainable in the long run.
Which of course leaves us with the big, final question. The cradle-to-grave state was born from the ashes of war. It was a noble, incredible promise of security and stability for everyone. But in our world of economic shocks, global competition, and rising debt, is it a promise we can still afford to keep? That question right there, that is the enduring and very complicated legacy of Europe's grand experiment.